It is a great honor and a privilege to sit here in the Ontario Legislative Assembly as the elected representative for the riding of Carleton, Mississippi Mills. Carleton, Mississippi Mills is a wonderful mix of rural and urban, of old and new. The population is 25% rural and 75% urban. The city of Canada is the biggest urban area in the riding and is growing rapidly. There has been a population increase of 16,000 people in the last 5 years. Many of the people are new Canadians in our riding, and the biggest share of that population is Chinese people. There is a broad spectrum of industries in Carleton, Mississippi Mills, ranging from farms in the rural area that were established in the early 1800s to construction companies to the high-tech industry. Canada is the high-tech centre for Canada. It is a proud testimonial to the resiliency of the high-tech industry that they have been able to rebound after the failure of Nortel 10 years ago. They have created enough new jobs to replace all the jobs that were lost during the high-tech meltdown. Only now there are twice as many companies as there were back then. New, smaller companies created these jobs. This is innovation at its best. Many of the residents in the riding are also employed by the federal government, which is a very large employer that adds great long-term stability to our local economy. Carleton, Mississippi Mills is in the Ottawa Valley and with the Ottawa River as its northern boundary. As one stands on the shore of the Ottawa River, gazing across the majestic mile-wide body of water at the beautiful Gatineau Hills in Quebec, you can imagine the early explorer Samuel de Champlain canoeing up the river 400 years ago as he headed west. A few words about my family and our history and experience in the riding. My wife Janet, who is here in the gallery today, and I have been married for 32 years, and we have 3 daughters, Jessica, Rachel, and Alexis. Janet and all 3 girls are registered nurses, and I am very proud of them. Janet and Alexis is here sitting beside my wife, work at the Queensway Carleton Hospital in Ottawa. Rachel is working at a hospital in San Diego, and Jessica works at a hospital in Calgary. I graduated from Queen's University with a degree in civil engineering. I worked in engineering and construction in Vancouver for 3 years and Calgary for 7 years. I experienced the economic downturn of the oil industry in 1981. I lost my job in 1982. We had 2 babies and a mortgage, nobody was hiring, and house prices were falling fast. It was a terrible time for my family. I learned how devastating bad times can be. We came back to the family farm at MacLaren's Landing in 1982 and have been proud to be farming ever since. I lived and worked and raised my family in Carleton County, as did my father, and his father before him, and his father before him. Our farm was a Crown grant to our family in 1826. In our house, it was always understood that with the enjoyment and benefits of a healthy community comes the obligation to contribute to the community. For several generations, my family has been actively involved in politics at the municipal and provincial levels. When I was a boy, I can remember my father talking to Erskine Johnson, who was the MPP for the riding at the time. My father was one of Erskine Johnson's strongest grassroots supporters and communication links to the local community. Erskine was a great MPP. He was accessible to his constituents and helped his constituents. He was well thought of and respected in his community. He was an excellent role model. Over the past 30 years, I have had leadership roles in several community organizations. Most recently, I was president of the Ontario Landowners Association. Through these organizations, I have had experience dealing with bureaucrats and politicians from all 3 levels of government. I have traveled Ontario from Glengarry to Niagara, to Essex, to Manitoulin, to Sudbury, to Toronto, and places in between to answer calls for help. Calls for help from people who have government knocking on their door. We have become an overregulated society with regulations that are unnecessary or wrongful. This tells us what we already know, that the fight for freedom, justice, and democracy will never end. That if we relax our democratic guard, our freedoms will be taken away from us by those who think we should be controlled. We all know that government has become too strong, too big, too expensive, and too controlling. It is time to take control of the business of government. We must reduce our spending and our debt. We must eliminate the unnecessary regulations that interfere with the abilities of people, businesses, and communities to thrive. People must be free to be creative and innovative. I believe in small government, low taxes, and minimal regulation. I believe that government should exist to serve people, not rule over them. I believe it is the basic nature of men and women to do good, and men and women should be free to do what they want, so long as they do not hurt anyone or the environment. Ontario must once again become a welcome place to live and work and play. We must remember that the foundation of democracy is the Magna Carta of the year 1215. That wonderful document of 800 years ago defined that the common man had rights, the right to life, liberty, and property. It defined that government should serve people, that government was nothing but the instrument of the common man. The intention of the Magna Carta was clearly stated in William Pitt's oft-cited address to Parliament in 1763, and I quote, "The poorest man may in his cottage bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his forces may not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement." But somewhere along the line, government seems to have forgotten that freedom and democracy are the guaranteed right of the common man. This right is enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This guaranteed right is centuries old, the product of hard-won struggles and well-established jurisprudence. We have become an over-regulated, over-governed society. There are 500,000 regulations in Ontario.
Terrible.
Government has become too big, has gone too far, and is intruding into people's lives and businesses in an unwanted and wrongful way. Government has taken freedoms away from the common man. This is a problem. What do we do? As lawmakers, we must do something. We must remember that we are nothing but the servant of the common man. I would like to talk to you about some of my experiences with the Ontario Landowners Association, to tell some stories of wrongful actions by government. Mike Wesley, who is in our members gallery here, and 60 of his neighbors in rural Ottawa fought the City of Ottawa, the Ministry of Natural Resources, and the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority for 6 years to prevent their properties from being wrongfully designated as provincially significant wetlands. The problem developed over many years as all three agencies issued permits for new development of quarries, highways, housing subdivisions, and streets that caused more and new runoff into the creek that flowed through Mike's and his neighbors' properties. The result was that the increased water flow flooded their properties. Then the three agencies of government said their properties were a wetland and they intended to designate their lands as provincially significant wetlands. The Drainage Act states that a neighbor cannot increase or decrease the amount of water in a watershed that would harm a downstream neighbor. This position has been upheld in court, which is the basis of common law. Mike and his neighbors hired a large backhoe and they dug out the creek to increase the capacity of the creek. The drainage problem has been resolved. Wendell Palmer, who is also here in our members gallery, of the Niagara area, had an old and very large exotic breed of pig. The pig waddled when it walked and it had a slight limp. But Wendell's veterinarian said the pig was healthy, just old. An OSPCA inspector came to Wendell's farm and said the pig was in distress and must be destroyed immediately. Over Wendell's protests, she shot the pig 17 times in the head, but the pig was still alive. She went back to her office for a bigger gun.
That's terrible.
Wendell was left to the task of slitting the pig's throat to end its suffering. Wendell was charged with animal abuse.
What? That's terrible.
Steve Straub, a farm laborer of St. Thomas area, owned and cared for a variety of unusual birds and animals on his father's 5-acre home and property. The OSPCA handcuffed Steve and threw him into the back of the police cruiser as they seized his birds and animals. He pleaded guilty to the terrible crime of having a budgie bird cage with a dirty floor. The OSPCA order was written in the names of Steve and his father John because his father owned the land and the house, the only significant asset the family had. The OSPCA then sent invoices for the care and housing of Steve's birds and animals to Steve and John Straub jointly in the amount of $168,000.
Oh, goodness.
The OSPCA took Steve and John to civil court to collect the bill. The judge threw out all the invoices except for $5,000. Ed Embry, a farmer near Napanee, has been hounded by the Kingston Ministry of the Environment for 7 years over a minor manure spill onto a neighbor's farm field. The MOE persisted over the years with inspections and charges and took Ed to court many times. Recently, the Justice of the Peace threw out all of the charges, saying they were frivolous. In November 2009, Major Mark Tyson, and Mark's mother Linda is here in the gallery with us today, was charged under 4 different sections of the Food Safety and Quality Act because he bought a pig from a local farmer and slaughtered it to feed his family. A Ministry of Natural Resources enforcement officer sat in a neighbor's tree stand for 5 days watching Mark and his children in their home with night vision goggles. The MNR then raided Mark's home with 6 squad cars with lights flashing.
It's terrible.
The maximum fine was $100,000, but Mark was told that if he pleaded that the fine would be reduced to $1,000 if he pleaded guilty. But Mark said he didn't do anything wrong and decided to fight the charges in court. Major Tyson acted as his own attorney, arguing that he had a constitutional right to choose the food he wants to eat. On December 6, 2011, the MNR delivered a letter to Major Tyson stating that they intended to drop all charges after 2 long years of court appearances.
How much of our money was wasted on that?
That's right. There's a waste.
Bob Mackey of Beamsville, who is in the gallery with us today, set up a small archery training business on his 9-acre rural property. About 7 years ago, the Niagara Escarpment Commission, which is a local planning authority, ordered Bob to stop his archery business because his land had an agricultural use designation in their official plan, and archery was not mentioned as a permitted use on agricultural land. The official plan doesn't mention archery as a prohibited activity, it just doesn't mention it at all. This is contrary to common law, which is practiced in Ontario, which states that a man can do whatever he wants unless it is prohibited by law or regulation. Bob continues his 7-year fight for his rights in court. George Ng and his neighbors own land at Mount Albert. They excavate and sell peat from their land. That is their business, their livelihood, and they have been doing it for over 40 years. 4 years ago, the Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority designated their properties as provincially significant wetlands and told George and his neighbors they were breaking the law by excavating peat. They were told to stop doing business. George and a few neighbors have been charged and are in court fighting for their rights and their livelihoods using their Crown Land Patent Grant as their property rights defense.
This is in Ontario.
These are examples of the negative effects that some of the 500,000 regulations that we have in Ontario are having on people's freedoms and rights.
Government without common sense.
We need to make changes that will restore these lost liberties and property rights. Life, liberty, and private property ownership are the foundation of any successful democracy. The law, which is a collective will of individuals, is intended to provide justice to protect liberty and property. If a man takes another man's property without his permission, it is illegal theft or plundering. If government uses a law to take a man's property without his permission, it is legal plundering, but it is still plundering, and that is wrong. Such a wrongful law must be struck down. Thank you. I will be sharing my time with the member for Chatham, Kent, and Essex. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.